Hey everyone. Last week in our intro week, we looked at why we should care about history, looked at some things history might be good for, some things maybe it isn't so good for. This week, we're beginning our quick survey of historiography via this book, which hopefully you all have access to at this point. There's a couple of ways to define historiography. This book is subtitled The Story of Historiography, and the first chapter kind of defines it, but I don't think it's very good, so we're not reading it. For our purposes, I think it's important to define the term. For our purposes, it's really the history of how people have written history. So we have the past. This is a little bit of a review from last time. We have the past, stuff that happened, right? And we have history, which is the stuff that people have written about the past. So when we examine the history of how history has been written, we're doing historiography. And that's what this book does. It's a survey of how historians have written, even if they weren't professional historians, how people have written about history in the past and why it's changed so much over time. So in this class, you are learning about the past. It's a history class, so that's good. But instead of medieval kings or the Civil War, revolutions, environment, labor history, food, we're learning about the stories people have told about the past and how they've completely shifted over time and sort of come back to things that have gone out of fashion and new things come in all the time. So that's what we're doing. Why do we care about historiography? Why do we care about studying the history of history? In short, it's a profound illustration of how history is not an objective discovery of the past or recitation of the past. It's the story of what a particular historian is interested in, what a culture of historians at a particular moment in history is interested in, determined by how these historians want to use the past to shape the future. I mentioned last time we can look at a lot of history from the mid-20th century, even the late 20th century. Books, articles, whatever, that were highly praised at the time. We look back now and say, that was pretty bad. What's changed? Well, it's not that the past has changed, obviously, but the kinds of questions historians ask, who they study, what they study, how they study it, these absolutely change over time. And the reason certain topics or histories get written is constantly in flux. And guiding all these changes is the fact that histories are meant to serve a purpose. Right? They have an objective, they have a story, they have an agenda. All of them do. It's not just documenting what happened, although obviously histories do that, right? They tell you something about the past. They tell you what happened, and there's usually pretty good agreement about what happened. But the question is really, what does it mean? Who cares? What were the implications? Historians living in their cultural moment decide what is interesting and useful and how it should be related to the present. And these histories that people write at different times in different ways have tremendous power. Okay? History creates identity. It empowers certain people. It removes power from other people. It provides justification for certain policies, for the way we categorize certain people, the way we enact legislation. Precedent is one of the most powerful forces in our legal system, right? Previous judicial decisions, whether it's Supreme Court or a state court or whatever, it doesn't matter. The fact that there is a precedent, there is a way of doing something has tremendous power, right? Our legal system is, it's English, it's Roman, it's German, it's Greek, it has a long history, but precedent is one of the things that underlies all of these different systems. How things end up being done is not the product of one event. Precedent is not just one case. I mean, sometimes it is, but usually it's a whole system, it's a whole set of the ways people did something, right? That's a collection of events. That's history, right? So history dictates through this idea of precedent in the legal system and also in other ways as well, how things happen today, why things are the way they are. And you can't understand the world unless you understand these precedents. That's understanding history. It's understanding the past. So not only do subjects and methods change over time, but ideas about truth and objectivity change over time. All these are products. Truth, objectivity, all these related concepts are products of particular cultures and particular places and times. Objectivity has been a hallmark of modern science, right? And the history profession for a long time. But it's wrong to say that modern history is somehow necessarily more objective today. Okay? Objective history can't tell you why something is important by definition, right? If you're being objective, you're just reporting what happened as best you can determine it from the historical record. To say why something is important is a subjective determination, right? History would be really boring and really useless if all we could do was report on the past. When we interpret it and say why it mattered and what the consequences were and what the unintended consequences were and what the legacy was, then we're doing something interesting, but that's far from objective, right? And this is not to say history is totally biased and useless or flawed in its fiction and so on. Not at all. But we have to be honest and realistic about what it can and can't say, and about truth and objective facts. Looking at the ways in which past historians have written and how they have changed and why they have changed makes us much more critical readers of contemporary history. Books, but also Wikipedia, film, historical fiction, social media. We learn history. We formulate our collective memory. We create stories. We propagate some, we discard others through all these media, right? And not just history. So learning to read history critically, and again, historical distance makes it a lot easier to sort of understand how other people interact in the world, means learning to read everything else more critically too. And that's really what university is for, right? General awareness of what is and what isn't in front of you. A couple bigger themes. That's my little introduction to historiography, by the way. A couple themes to keep in mind, 3 things to keep in mind as you start the chapters in here. We're skipping chapter 1, so it's chapters 2 and 3. The book is pretty straightforward. I don't think I need to do a whole lot of, introductory stuff. It's written for people who don't know anything about history. I'm sure you're well beyond where the author thinks that you are, which is good. But it sort of introduces everything or most everything pretty well. So I don't need to give you a lot of background. But I do want to highlight a couple sort of broader themes that I think are really strong in these chapters, but don't get a lot of explicit attention in the chapters themselves. So I want to highlight these as something I think you should be keeping in mind as you read, and probably will show up on a quiz or something like that later on. Number 1, history as basis for community. I mentioned history and identity a moment ago. I think it was in the Stearns reading last week as well. I want to approach this question about sort of how is history related to identity by considering the difference between history and myth. And if you ask somebody what's the difference, I think the knee-jerk reaction is that history is generally true and myth is generally false. And there's a lot more overlap than that. Okay, so let's probe a bit deeper. I mean, one difference you could point to is in sources. Myths are more about traditional storytelling, usually oral traditions, that deal with origin stories. How did this come to be in the world? How did this happen? History is grounded in archives, documents. It's very empirical. You need to have citations and so on. And that's a significant difference for sure. But a difference in methods is not necessarily a difference in purpose. So how much of what we think of as myth, which we often analyze in terms of truth, is really just a way of explaining the world in different terms than what we're used to, right? So we have historical explanations for what happened in the past and why the world is the way it is. And we sort of internalize these. And when we see something that doesn't fit into that paradigm or doesn't follow that model, we tend to slide it into the myth category. Poetic senses of time. When you read a history that has these very amorphous, non-linear, non-structured definitions of time, we start to think this isn't really fact. When we see personifications of deities or animals or forces in the world, we tend to think this isn't true. This is myth. Why is the sun god being reborn every year? That's not history, right? That's myth, right? That's what the typical perception is. You can find a lot of differences along those lines, right? Because we have a framework, our own view of what history is. But the key thing I want to point out is both history and myth, both try to understand change. And part of why we want to understand that change is to build a sense of community. And it might be a small nation state, in ancient Greece. It might be a modern nation in the 21st century, right? Different communities, different size, cities, regions, whatever. Building a sense of community, right? Myth and history serves the same kind of function in these ways. If they serve the same purpose, to what extent would you say history is basically a more scientific version of myth? Is one more true than the other? Well, standards of knowledge production change. Standards of historical truth change. Would we think history is more objective now without the scientific revolution that made empiricism the primary way of creating knowledge, where you have to have citations and evidence and so on? Doesn't myth just try to create sort of an archetypal history that isn't bogged down by nitty-gritty details that don't matter, sort of the nuance that I referenced in the other video? My point here is that myth and history are actually really hard to separate if you think about how much each is really about community. Imagine people 2,000 years from now. We're starting, chapter 2 here is about ancient Greek and Roman history, so about 2,000 years ago. Imagine people 2,000 years from now reading our histories. Are they going to read what we write now about history that we think is really good history? Are they going to look at it and say that's good history, or is that myth? Second point, conceptions of time. As you read through these chapters in the whole book, and the whole class actually, keep in mind the importance of the conceptions of time to understanding the value of history. Is history linear or cyclical? Do civilizations rise and fall routinely? Is there any way of sort of understanding where you are in that cycle? To give a quick example from what you'll read this week, as the power of Rome consolidated and strengthened, themes of history no longer centered on complex histories of city-states, namely Greek city-states, but the rise and fall of states and empire, namely the Roman Empire. They had a much more cyclical view of time than did fathers of the Christian church who came later and employed a much more linear sense of time, right? So how you conceptualize time is something we hardly ever think about in the day-to-day world that we live in, right? It is what it is, right? I hate that phrase, but it's perfectly apt for right now. You don't think about time. It's time, right? But when you think about sort of how conceptions of time can change over long periods of time, right? Think of the railroad and the clock and how that changed people's sense of time when there's a rigid thing as opposed to sundials and sort of seasonal change and so on. When you have a precise definition of time, your sense of history is going to be different, right? When you are trying to sort of show that your civilization is meant to be the last and most powerful one, your sense of time is going to be different than when you're writing a history of the Christian church, where there is a much more linear sense of time. So why does conception of time matter? I mean, I'm trying to make the point that it's really important. Why does it matter for history? Because it determines, at least in part, what you study, how you write, and how you use history. Point 3, historical progress. How much does the fact that we study history at all, to study the past at all, presume that there is some sort of progress to be made in terms of history? We want to learn from the past. We can learn something, again, specific lessons, maybe not, but we can learn something and then we can be better, whatever that means. We can be a better society. We can be a better country. We can be a better species, whatever it is. How much is progress central to the reason, to our belief that we should be and can be better? How much of that is central to the reason that we study the past at all? I think it's pretty important. There's two kinds of progress. Progress is mentioned a lot in this book, especially in the middle chapters that we'll get to a little bit later. There's two kinds of progress that I want to highlight because it's not always clear which the author is talking about, and in some ways it doesn't really matter, but I want to get it in your head that there's two very distinct ways that we need to think about progress. Progress can mean humans becoming more civilized or more enlightened. We're getting smarter, we're becoming more compassionate, and so on. Progress, that's one. The other one, progress can mean historians are getting better or more sophisticated at writing history. And you can see there's some overlap there. But I think they're different enough that we should keep those two conceptions in mind. Here's an example that illustrates both that we'll get to this week and next week as well in the book. Enlightenment historians, we'll read about that for Friday, so think 18th century, 1700s. And I'm talking about Western European historians, as the book does, wanted to understand the world through a very sort of narrow lens of whoever had gotten closest to them was the most civilized in the world. This was a time of imperialism and global expansion, lots of different people in the world. And so the one way of understanding all of these different peoples that were being discovered, all these different communities and cultures and so on, was to sort of figure out, where different cultures and civilizations were on this sort of path to enlightenment. And Enlightenment historians were very interested in the progress of humanity, and they saw that, understanding the progress of humanity, as the reason to write history. They thought that careful study of the past can reveal historical laws that could give insight into the future. That's one kind of progress you'll read about. So for them, good histories were stories of progress. Now, if you write a story of progress, that's seen as really flawed history. Who's correct? Are stories of progress good or not good? And there's no right answer. It really depends on the cultural moment of who's writing them, who's reading them, and what they want the history to be for. If you want to justify your place in the world, if you're living in Enlightenment France in the late 1700s, and you want to show the world that you're the most sophisticated, cultured, educated, you're the most entitled civilization, right? You're going to write histories that show that. When you want to show that lots of different people have their own stories that are all equally valuable, writing stories of progress don't make any sense. Okay. With the rise of nationalism in the mid-19th century, history became more professionalized, it became more scientific, it became much more focused on nations. Historians decided that these ideas of universal historical laws, or sort of understanding people by virtue of how civilized they've become, was absurd, right? History was no longer about a sense of progress. History served to write stories about people and land and heritage and who they are and how they're different from other people and what they're entitled to and so on. Historians at the time, in the mid-19th century, saw the shift in their own interests away from these sort of universal histories that explain sort of the relationship between all these different cultures as a kind of progress in historical writing. It got better by the fact that we sort of abandoned this sort of universal history in favor of much more local histories and national histories. Of course, there's problems with writing national histories that historians are now struggling with in a lot of different ways. And at this point, most historians don't pretend their work is as objective and universal as they did in the Enlightenment, or even the mid-20th century for that matter. And that too is seen as progress. So those are the two kinds of progresses, I guess, that you should keep in mind as you read the book. One, progress of humans, right? Are we getting better? Is that our goal? Is that what we're here to do, is become enlightened, become more civilized? And then the progress of historians. So how are we accommodating all these different people and cultures and habits and communities and claims about heritage that we have? How do we do that? And is there some sort of progress to be had in terms of how we write history as well? So they're kind of used interchangeably a little bit in the book, but it's, I think, very worth it to keep them a little bit separate, or be aware of those differences as you move through the text. That's it. Have a great week. I will see you. I will not see you. You will see me again early next week. Take care.